Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, Pettinger and Popescu, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, thank you very much for having me and our delegation in this forum. It's very symbolic for us. It's a very clear signal that we are not alone. And believe me, if war has demonstrated who our enemies and foes are, it also has demonstrated who our friends are. And I'm very pleased to be here among friends. Thank you very much once again. Now, thank you. Now, is diplomacy drifting? Diplomacy is an art. It's a masterpiece in a way, and for many people today it looks like Banksy's painting that has been shuttered right in the middle of the auction. Because some people might say that the war is basically a signal that diplomacy is not working. Other people would say that diplomacy is a continuation of war, just with some other means. But is it drifting? Perhaps it is. Does it mean that it's useless, though? No, it doesn't. But it shows that the world is becoming once again unstable, unsafe, vulnerable, fragmented, and less predictable. And that means that the old paradigms that makes us think of the end of the era of confrontation and perhaps even of the end of the history are not valid anymore. And as the clouds are thinking around the world, we shall learn to ride the storm. Now, how do we do that? All the long-lasting periods of peace have been known and have one thing in common. This is the presence of one single actor or one single player that is basically the guarantor of peace and security within a specific time period. Let us remember Pax Romana, that, for example, is an embodiment of peace within the territory of the former Roman Empire, guaranteed by the Roman Empire itself. However, Pax, or peace in Latin, it has a derivative of the military power of a single player. We had Pax Britannica, we had Pax Americana, we had Pax Sovietica, and even the Pax Europea that has failed in 2022. Now, in 2022, there is no such a global player anymore. It does not exist, as this recent developments unfortunately has shown us. And counterintuitive as it may sound, Ukraine, in a way, has become a de facto guarantor of world security. And Pax Ukraina is a reality in which the world lives today. I will explain you what I mean. I think that it is not the thing that Ukraine is able to single-handedly guarantee the peace and security in the region. We cannot, of course. It's not that Ukraine is some kind of a hegemon. We are not by all means. And it's not that our military power is not decisive. It is not. But the mere fact of our sovereignty and independence turned out to be an integral part of peace and security in the region, if not in the world. Now, this leads us to the necessity of a Ukrainian peace and not of the Ruski Mir, the Russian world that is being projected by Russia within the last 8 years, if not even more. Today, peace and security are possible not due to a single actor, but are impossible in the absence of such an actor. And that is why the loss of Ukraine's sovereignty or its occupation breaks the peace and leads to a multilateral war. And this is the main difference, ladies and gentlemen, between the world order and security orders that we face today. Today's peace is not the product of one single actor, but it is rather a cluster phenomenon. This is the result of interrelated factors and actors, and the absence of which, much more than the presence, leads to the war. Now, I would like to think and reflect with you what might have happened in case Ukraine would have been occupied in the very first day, just as Russia has planned on February 24. The first goal that would have been achieved by Russia would have been the assertion of the invincibility myth of Russian army and of its global influence. Imagine then the reputation of the collective West that regardless all of its efforts, all of its military assistance, intelligence assistance, trainings, and any other form of support, Russia and Russian military might have succeeded. This would be a catastrophe that would dramatically change the positioning of Russia on the world landscape. Moreover, it would reinforce its own feeling of invincibility, and this would put military power, mere brute force, in the first place, rather than economic power as it is today. Now, this would lead us to the second outcome, potential outcome. This is the strengthening of the influence of the populist parties in the EU. A strong and a reinforced Russia, reinvigorated by its theoretical hypothetical success in Ukraine, would mean that the Eurosceptics have now a very strong ally in the East. And this strong ally is backing the Eurosceptics and Eurosceptical governments all around Europe. And they will not only raise their heads, they will start demanding, they will change their tone, they will start acting as those who cannot be punished or cannot be ignored. They will not be marginals anymore. And this will lead us to the third potential consequences, the end of the pan-European project and the transatlantic projects, and the potential war on the European continent. However, I'm talking about an economic war, a war of intelligence, a war of trade. Because if then we imagine that these Russophiles and Eurosceptic forces gather some momentum and gather influence, and Ukraine is a fait accompli, the defeat of Ukraine is a fait accompli, then you will have a discussion in the EU. What happens next with the sanctions? Those countries who still believe in the transatlantic union, in the European Union, in the Western civilization values and principles, they will say we should keep the sanctions, we should put pressure on Russia, because this is the only way to punish it for what it has done. While another part of Europe, who depends on Russian money, who depends on Russian resources, and whose elites depend on Russian financing of their pensions, will tell you, no, we should lift the sanctions, because the sanctions, after the fait accompli of a potential defeat, are just a way to escalate further conflict. We should ease this conflict, and we should lift the sanctions from there. And this will lead us to the fourth potential consequence, which is basically the Kremlinization of Europe. What do I mean by that? I mean that we won't recognize the European landscape in a matter of 5 to 10 years. Because, ladies and gentlemen, if that was the case in such a scenario in the development that I'm describing, that would mean that Europe would be particled, that would be segregated in a number of different sides and parties. One clearly advocating and supporting the pro-Russian agenda, and the other the pro-European, pro-Western and transatlantic agenda. And the implications would be absolutely dramatic for this. Now, is there a way to escape this? Because as we see now, and as I agree very much with the previous speakers, unfortunately we don't do enough to make Ukraine win this war. I think there is. Diplomacy cannot drift towards impunity, and foreign affairs cannot drift towards accommodation of terrorists. One simple solution that I want you to leave this conference with in your mind is that the West has to have a unified Putin policy, a unified policy on Putin. It's simply unacceptable and impossible that when you ask countries like the UK, the States, the Baltic countries, Poland or other countries, what should we do with Putin? They will tell you he is a terrorist. He should be prosecuted. But when you go to some other countries in the EU who have incredible economic powers, they tell you, no, we should sit with him and try to find a way to discuss and to negotiate. There was no such a thing with Milosevic. There was no such a thing with Bashar Assad. There was no such a thing with bin Laden, at least. Why we have such situation with Putin? Because it is so very well interconnected, but what is the main difference between those guys? So unless the EU, the West, the collective West, has a unified single policy on Putin, I'm afraid this war will continue to go on, because it directly affects the speed, the velocity, and the hesitation in terms of the military assistance to Ukraine. So this would be my main message to you. Please go back to your countries, go back to your governments, and make this point. We need a single, unified Putin policy of the West. Thank you very much.